Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. Hope that we're worth the wait. We are so excited that y'all are here and that this amazing panel is here today to talk about all things spectrum. So let's do a quick introduction, if I may. But before I do have a nice little blurb about how this amazingly talented group of congressional staff are here. And they've taken the time to come all the way to Washington. We have many congressional staff in the audience too, and we're so appreciative that y'all are all here. To take your time in 30 hours that you're allowed to be here with Senate ethics and House ethics. You're here to talk about things that are so important to this economy and to this country. So with that, I'd love to do a quick introduction. First, on my left is Betsy McIntyre, Senior Counsel. She works for Chair Cantwell on the Senate Commerce Committee. And I have to add a plug. She's a Vanderbilt graduate, Vanderbilt alum, nice. And we have to do a quick shout out to their amazing game last Saturday night. If you didn't see it, it was quite the game, so congratulations. It's been 40 years.
It was all me.
SEC football, yes.
Right.
Bring it back. Second, we have Arielle Roth, the Policy Director for Ranking Member Ted Cruz on the Senate Commerce Committee. Third is John Lynn, Senior Counsel in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, working for Chair Kathy McMorris Rogers. And last but not least is Jennifer Epperson, Chief Counsel for Ranking Member Frank Pallone on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And again, we're so thankful that y'all are here and took the time. So thank you to everyone. So let's get to it. We've heard a lot about spectrum today. We started with the keynotes this morning. It's all about spectrum. And one of the things that we have all seen and faced for the past 18 months is auction authority has lapsed. And not only has it lapsed, but the pipeline is empty. There's nothing left. So we've heard a lot about this today. So everybody here wants to hear from y'all about what's the plan? What are we thinking? But I want to start with, it's been 18 months. What are the implications for the auction authority lapsing from the domestic and international consequences? So if we could just talk about that, with auction authority lapsing, what are those consequences and what does that look like? May I start with you?
Sure.
Thank you.
So obviously not having spectrum auction authority is a huge problem. I don't need to explain that to the folks here. Without spectrum, you don't have spectrum to feed technological innovations for current use and for future uses as well. And long term, there is a concern that without spectrum auction authority, the impact that this is going to have on competition in the mobile wireless market. Just 2 years ago, the FCC came out with its communications marketplace report, and it noted that for facilities-based mobile wireless, the industry currently is, or at the time, highly concentrated. That's antitrust parlance for there's a few big players who are dominating the market. And when you have a key input for an industry that is not being allowed to get there to the folks who need it, it can present a problem for competition. The small guys need this too. We heard that earlier today, how important having spectrum auction authority is for the smaller players. When you have less competition, it can lead to higher prices, it can lead to less technological innovation. And, we need to get this up and running. Internationally, when you don't have spectrum auction authority, it is just giving Huawei and ZTE a win, right? When you have spectrum auction authority happening and spectrum getting to market, you are enabling new players for when all the carriers are trying to touch up their networks to accept a new spectrum band to their systems. You are providing secure alternatives to Huawei and ZTE, like O-RAN. You're giving them a market opportunity to provide their services to carriers who need it. And this is the thing, right? Huawei and ZTE have so many advantages. Why give them this as well? So there's a huge domestic and international consequence in the current situation. And we get questions like this all the time. because we have interesting characters asking us questions about, isn't Spectrum Auction Authority turning on going to hurt our equities? And this is what we need to respond to them with. So, anyway.
Betsy, thank you for your comments. Arielle, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, completely agree with Betsy. Auction Authority is critical to the U.S.'s wireless leadership. We pioneered spectrum auctions thanks to the work of Ronald Coase. We demonstrated to the world the value maximizing effect of spectrum auctions for consumers. And restoring Auction Authority is incredibly important, but doing it on its own isn't enough if we don't have spectrum to auction. And so, in addition to restoring Auction Authority, we also need a clear, predictable plan for conducting auctions, making more spectrum available for commercial use. In other words, a spectrum pipeline. And so, at least from our position on the Hill, Ranking Member Cruz strongly supports reinstating Spectrum Auction Authority, but he's consistently held that any long-term, multi-year extension of Auction Authority or reinstatement of Auction Authority cannot occur without a robust spectrum pipeline.
Thank you, Arielle. John, anything to add?
Well, first, thank you to CTIA and Sarah for having us here. We always love. It's great to be out here with so many old friends and colleagues. To answer your question, on a practical point, every day that we go without Spectrum Auction Authority means that the FCC cannot auction off the licenses that are currently has in inventory that could be put to use immediately to help grow our wireless economy, but also can't do the work that needs to happen to prepare for future auctions. It's just as important. And as we sideline ourselves from this internationally, what's happening? Our biggest competitor, China, is gaining an edge by making more spectrum available on their own, which gives them an advantage not just economically. So that threatens our wireless and economic leadership. It's also a big security problem because the last thing we want is our biggest adversary to have more spectrum available and to beat us and to get ahead of us when it comes to economic security. So on both a national and economic security point, we need to have Spectrum Auction Authority back. And the longer we go without Spectrum Auction Authority, the greater risk we put ourselves in.
Thank you for those comments. Jennifer?
Yeah, I'll just say that it's clearly a bruise on U.S. leadership worldwide to not have Auction Authority, this incredible innovation. And hurting our competitiveness, innovation, things that are should be happening. U.S. should be leading on, but I think the problem is a political one, and unfortunately, the reason I think the situation is what it is, as we've all been trying so hard to move the ball here, is unfortunately sort of years of building sort of distrust between agencies and different kind of industry sectors or folks that are spectrum users, and that is because of all these great innovations and the value of having a limited resource in spectrum. And so I think there's been a lot of work that's been happening. I think you've seen sort of spectrum sort of policy that's being developed in legislation, and meanwhile the administration is doing really hard work to try to rebuild that trust and at the same time do important spectrum studies that I think will help grow that trust and collaboration here. I think there was a real concern by my boss about the disputes that sort of were coming up over and over again about this valuable resource. And, I think it's really important that when the government speaks, it speaks with one voice and its decisions are final. And I think there's a lot that is being worked on, I think legislatively as well as administratively. And, hopefully we also have that slice of important policy that is Auction Authority as soon as we can get there. But, it's going to take, a lot of work, and hopefully we can continue to move the ball.
Jennifer, thank you for your comments. Thanks for everybody's for their comments. It's a nice segue to talk about the legislation. In the Senate, we've seen 2 bills introduced, and one of which is Chair Cantwell's spectrum bill, the Spectrum and National Security Act. So Betsy, I was wondering if I could just turn it to you and kind of give an overview of that bill, that legislation, kind of the thought process behind it, and kind of where things are. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, absolutely, and probably most of this room know it better than I do at this point. But her bill is the Spectrum and National Security Act. It's got 3 main points, and the first we've all just been talking about is Spectrum Auction Authority, but I'll kind of explain it from, since it is the Spectrum and National Security Act, that's our target audience. Turning on Spectrum Auction Authority and having the flexibility to maximize spectrum, including through sharing mechanisms, following up on the success of CBRS and the potential of the promise of dynamic spectrum sharing. But there's also other types of things that show that there's a national security component just for turning Spectrum Auction Authority back on that I'd kind of like to communicate to you all, and if there are other ideas, I'd love to hear from you. We listen to the earnings calls of companies, and in July, here I was just listening intently on Verizon's call, and they just talked about how they landed this 10-year, $2.7 billion contract with the US Navy for IoT, data, voice across the country for federal and civilian personnel. So here we have commercial wireless being used by one of our military branches, and they're benefiting from commercial wireless use. And so, there is a national security component just to turning Spectrum Auction Authority on. The second part of her bill is having a sustainable spectrum pipeline, something that, these are important decisions. There isn't any greenfield spectrum, right? You're going to have to, at some point, make hard decisions about spectrum that the federal government is using. And there's going to have to be decisions made about whether it's appropriate at all, and if so, how, to make that usable in a commercial sense, putting in a pipeline for the FCC to auction off. Senator Cantwell knows that those are incredibly important decisions, because these decisions, if reallocation decision is made, really does have a critical impact on a very important agency missions. So she thinks those decisions are really tough, and it's so important for them to be based on science and facts and data with a thorough assessment on agency impacts, as opposed to mandating a certain amount of spectrum before any study is done. The third pillar, the third component of her bill is also just what Jennifer mentioned, fixing what has been up until recently a broken interagency process. That is, it's not good for the agencies who have spectrum equities. It's not good for the companies who are trying to get commercial spectrum. It makes us look silly in international fora, and it just doesn't enable us to have a unified domestic front. Beyond those 3 pillars, she also is using the funds from the spectrum auctions for important national priorities, such as the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program, RIP and Replace, CHIPS and Science Development, and Next Gen 911.
Thank you. Sure. Appreciate the thorough review. And Arielle, next I'll turn to you if you don't mind. Senator Cruz introduced the Spectrum Pipeline Act, and that legislation would make over 1,200 megahertz of mid-band spectrum available for 5G. Can you kind of walk us through that legislation and kind of your thoughts there?
So in our view, the best tried and true way to make spectrum available for 5G and beyond, compete against China, protect our national economic security, is through spectrum pipeline legislation with clear and specific requirements to auction spectrum according to a clear and predictable timeline for conducting auctions, not just studies. And so that's why, in partnership with Senator Thune and Senator Blackburn, Ranking Member Cruz introduced the Spectrum Pipeline Act of 2024, which would make available a large amount of mid-band spectrum available for commercial use, including 1,250 megahertz for full power use, which is something we truly need in order to maintain and restore our international leadership.
Thank you for those comments. We've been talking about spectrum auctions and the proceeds that have been raised since 1993. So I'm going to kind of turn to that. I mean, we are 4 weeks away from the election, y'all. Cannot believe we woke up this morning and I'm like, oh wow, 4 weeks. And talking about priorities for next year. We're going to have a new administration, either a Harris administration or a Trump administration, and what that's going to look like in January of next year. And kind of the question that I kind of wanted to tee up was, in the past, spectrum auction provisions have typically been included in budget bills because auctioning spectrum can produce a score. Providing dollars that Congress can spend or use to offset other spending. And as we mentioned earlier, since 1993, spectrum auctions have raised over $233 billion. And I would just say real quick, I have more fun going into offices, congressional offices, the ones that don't do spectrum day in and day out like we do. And when you mention that, their eyes pop out of their head. They're like, what? How much money have you given to the Treasury? And what can be used for congressional priorities? And so that's kind of the question where I was going to go here. Is there are a number of congressional priorities? You mentioned several of those, Betsy, in your legislation that need money. How do these priorities play a role in spectrum policy? And I'd like to ask that of the whole panel. So Betsy, if I may.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, spectrum is one piece of the mobile or the wireless market ecosystem, and so. Okay, sure, spectrum is the piece that provides the funding, but there's also pieces that you have to put in for funding initiatives to help the wireless ecosystem. For the smaller providers who, again, need the benefit of having auction authority, they need money for rip and replace. Some of them are going to turn off significant parts of their networks without it, and they need this money. So ACP, some carriers, just especially the small ones, I keep going back to the small ones, the small and medium providers, without ACP, are they able to provide the same kind of low-income broadband alternative as their larger players? That's tough, in addition to the fact that there are families who, no matter what, they just needed ACP to have broadband, period. Next Gen 911, all these things, but are helpful to the overall functioning of the system for competition, the public interest, and just consumer benefits.
Thank you for that. Arielle?
Yeah, so it's certainly true that spectrum auctions raise large amounts of money for the US Treasury, hundreds of billions of dollars since 1994. But viewing spectrum primarily as a pay-for opportunity can be short-sighted, and it can obscure the true value of spectrum for American consumers. The value of getting another 100 megahertz into the commercial marketplace 1 year sooner pays dividends in terms of economic growth and in terms of jobs that far eclipses the amount that an auction will raise. And we've seen this in recent studies by BCG and also Dr. Raoul Katz's recent study on unlicensed spectrum. We're talking trillions of dollars for the economy, not just billions. And so, while Ranking Member Cruz is certainly, open to using spectrum proceeds for congressional priorities, his spectrum bill, is focused on getting spectrum policy right at the outset, rather than letting spending drive the spectrum policy. I think that if we let spectrum legislation become, little more than a pay-for opportunity, that has the potential to distort our policy decisions in a harmful way. So that's why we need to get the policy right before we get to the spending.
So yeah, obviously spending is a very important part of the discussion, and oftentimes part of what needs to be agreed to make a broader deal. But I completely agree with everything with what Arielle just said. You have to get the spectrum policy right first before you talk about spending. Now, obviously, we have our spending priorities. We want to get rip and replace funded, as Betsy mentioned, and spectrum auction proceeds are one of the few areas where the authorizing committee gets to dictate where the funding gets to go. But again, we don't want that to be the driver here, and we want to make sure we get the policy right, get the term right for how long we want auction authority to last, make sure we get the right pipeline in place so we know we can get, we know what kind of revenue that would generate. That needs to be the driver first, getting those details right, and then we can talk about how much what can we do with all this fun money that we get to play with. Hopefully a lot, but that's a matter of, again, make sure let's get it right first before we start to get ahead of ourselves.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with this. I think the spectrum policy is the first part to make sure that a balanced portfolio doesn't always mean the most proceeds, but I think that's important. Looking at sound policy, spectrum policy, and then no appropriations staff here, right? We get to have decide what the priorities are, and hopefully come to an agreement that makes everybody happy.
Well, shifting gears, and again, we've heard a lot about this conversation, but China, which has consumed a lot of oxygen in Congress. The House has a select committee on the Chinese Communist Party dedicated to building consensus around the threats posed to the United States by them. China is aggressively making mid-band spectrum available for 5G after seeing firsthand the benefits of the 4G economy in the United States. They've planned, they don't have an FCC. they have planned to make, yeah, exactly. They don't need, they are planning to make 4 times the amount of mid-band spectrum available for 5G than the United States. So Jennifer, I'm gonna start with you. I don't want you to feel left out,
Right.
but I want to ask about, do you think Congress appreciates the value of leading in wireless innovation and what that ultimately means for global competitiveness?
I certainly think that the members understand the importance of this global competitiveness and U.S. leading. I think at probably every hearing, somebody asks that at least 2 or 3 times.
You mentioned it in all of our opening statements.
Exactly, it's always on the tip of everybody's tongue. I think obviously China's whole kind of governing structure is very different than ours. So I think sometimes we have to make sure that we're thinking of our priorities and the way we value democracy and human rights and free speech and all those things, right? And I think that's an important kind of place where there's really been a history now, years of bipartisanship around making sure that U.S. is meeting and leading this innovation here and leading in technology and wireless innovation and things like that. So I think that the China threat is real. Everybody feels it, but I think there's places where we as everybody's mentioned, I think rip and replace still needs to happen. That isn't done yet, right? The connectivity side of it. So there are many areas where the China kind of issue helps move the ball forward, but I think that it's still very real to the members.
Thank you for those comments, John.
Yeah, I mean, for our committee, it's, as Jennifer and I just mentioned, it's been a top priority. We've had a number of hearings that focus just purely on this China threat. We passed legislation this year, signed a lot of the TikTok legislation, primarily to target one of the biggest threats that China poses on our national security. In terms of not just, obviously getting spectrum and getting the right pipeline in place is going to be an important part of competing against China, but also doing other things to strengthen our ability to compete with China when it comes to our wireless leadership includes things like making sure that we're well represented at standards bodies, at ITU, at all these places where we're setting the rules of the road for future wireless technology. We need to be there, and we need to strengthen our representatives there. We're hearing that China is flooding these meetings with, engineers and Huawei and ZTE representatives, and that's not good for us. It's not good for our values. That's not good for wireless leadership. That's not good for our security. And so it's something that we are trying to prioritize as well, as making sure that not just are we competing with them with spectrum, but also in these governing bodies so that our values and our leadership can be maintained.
Thank you. Arielle, any thoughts?
No, I think I agree mostly with what John just said. Two components that are needed in order to compete against our adversaries, particularly China, are, not to beat a dead horse, but a spectrum pipeline legislation, and getting more spectrum into the commercial marketplace, particularly mid-band, and having a clear, unified position at an international standard setting for like the World Radio Communication Conference, so that we can ensure that U.S. interests are maximized.
Thank you. Betsy?
Yeah, I mean, just following up on all of these good points here, fixing or ensuring longevity in a right-setted spectrum management process where we don't revert to previous years of a broken spectrum interagency management process that strengthens the U.S.'s ability to have a unified domestic position on spectrum, which will only help them when they realize, okay, let's have a unified ability at the ITU for the U.S. position, ensuring that we have representation on this international spectrum, the standard setting bodies. I think that piece of a unified domestic approach to spectrum is a strong antidote to making sure that we're leading internationally.
Thank you for those comments. Shifting over to spectrum management, we've all heard and witnessed this for years now. We know that 60% of mid-band spectrum, that 5G friendly spectrum, is currently occupied by the federal government and primarily by the Department of Defense. Our belief is that you can't have a strong national defense without a strong national economy, and wireless is a big part of a healthy U.S. economy. So with all these conversations that are taking place on the Hill, how does DoD or even agencies like the Department of Transportation, which with C-band, we remember that over the holidays a couple years ago, play into those conversations that we're having on Capitol Hill? Can you give us a little window into some of those conversations and thoughts? How about I'll start with John?
Yeah, so it's definitely a big factor because at least to get any spectrum legislation passed into law, we're going to need the votes of a lot of our, obviously the majority, but the more the better. And the Armed Services Committees on both chambers, the intelligence committees, play a big have a lot of power. And anytime anytime they bring their generals in, they talk about national security. A lot of members will just take them at their word and oppose whatever spectrum bill we come up with that might threaten DoD's interests. So it's definitely something that we have to have in the back of our mind and kind of work around. That's where things like trying to work with them and having administration leadership is going to be very important. Having the administration kind of forcing DoD to back down on certain things, having them play nicely with us is a big way to try to get around this. But when it comes to trying to pass, I'll speak blunt here. The Armed Services Committees have been some of the biggest obstacles to trying to get a spectrum bill, a spectrum pipeline put together, and we're still trying. That's one reason why we haven't been able to get our bill that we were able to pass unanimously out of the E&C committee out of the House yet. Is we still have some obstacles there with the national security committees, and we're still trying to get through them, trying to move, trying to get them to see our side, and it was easier before, but I think the battles we've had the last few years, especially in the recent years, has elevated spectrum in the eyes of a lot of other stakeholders on the Hill, and they guard their spectrum very closely. And so anytime we threaten that, it causes a big fight. And I'm sure on your side, it's similar to what we experience.
Yeah, but I think importantly, just like you said, part of it is just kind of years of building mistrust. And so oftentimes, I think we've all had this experience, like when you sit down, if they see a proposal, it's automatically assumed to be the worst or the most threatening to their, kind of holdings or their mission, things like that, right? But when you sit down and talk about it, usually you can sort of, they understand both sides. I think unfortunately there's just the level of sort of distrust that I think is built, unfortunately, over the years, it does not help in our process. And I think, you have an administration that's working on this, but then you have like the Hill and the political leadership and those are still not always on the same page, and that can be problematic.
I said one thing. We've had stakeholders come in and say, well, in 2012 when you did the Spectrum Act, it was easy to get DoD on board. It's like, well, that was 10 years ago, and I don't know how many Spectrum fights ago. Like, this is a very different world now, in which anytime we talk about DoD Spectrum, immediately we have generals coming in and calls being made that we're going to undermine national security, and that's just a very new reality of the Hill these days that we're unfortunately still trying to figure out our way around. I'm sure the Senate has similar issues.
No, just to pick up on one thing that John said, I think that this just goes to show the need for strong leadership from the administration on spectrum policy. Congress spoke clearly in the NTIA Organization Act that NTIA is the entity in charge of setting, the official arbiter of federal spectrum policy as applied as with respect to executive branch agencies, and so it would be, we need to have strong, clear guidance from the administration and the White House that NTIA is that official voice, and it also reminds me of the fact that, like, during the Trump administration, the federal government did take decisive action in getting 100 megahertz of spectrum in 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band for 5G use, and that was thanks to decisive action and leadership of the White House, the FCC, and DoD. So this kind of strong leadership is possible, and we just need to repeat some of that.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up. I think the story that you're hearing, and that especially in the Senate that we deal with, is right now there's a spectrum management process that's been in place that had some input from the federal agencies who have spectrum equities. The intent with that, which is also part of Senator Cantwell's bill, is to build some process and to prevent the spectrum management chaos of the past. I mean, how many instances of problems have delayed spectrum or impacted agency missions, right? We had the spat with C-SPAN, with the C-band on C-SPAN with the FCC and FAA. There was like a 10-year delay to finally doing something with the legato spectrum, and even when that was voted on by the FCC, it triggered a huge fight. To me, that just speaks to the need for having a spectrum management process in place in law, so that we can continue to move forward, get spectrum out there without, oh, psych, never mind, we'll bring it back because of some problem with the interagency. I think that has to be a part of this equation, so that NTIA can effectively be a leader if there's a solid process in place.
Thank you for those comments.
But it has to be the right process, because the presidential memo includes a process whereby federal agencies could retroactively challenge an FCC spectrum decision. I guess we think that codifying that could create a lot of uncertainty and would harm commercial spectrum investment. So we need to get, process is certainly important as long as it's the right process, but it's also no substitute for decisive, strong leadership from the administration.
And that builds on part of the Communications Act, which allows the president to do the same thing.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We're going to shift gears now and talk about ACP. Like Auction Authority, ACP lapsed this year. I think we all agree that there's a social benefit to connecting every American that wants to be connected. But I know many of you and your bosses have differing opinions on ACP. So my question to the panel here is, do you think the program can be resurrected? And if so, what reforms should be included? And how about I start with Jennifer?
Yes. Yeah, I think there's nobody who doesn't know that Ranking Member Pallone and the House Democrats are very supportive of the program. I do think at this point, though, your important question about resurrecting it, I don't think that it's good for the program to sort of have these starts and stops. I think that builds distrust in the very people that the program is intended to help. And so I think to have a strong program in place, there needs to be a sustainable, pay for that, it doesn't require, a huge chunk of money through appropriations every year, because we just know politically that's very challenging. So I think the important part at this point is to have a long-term sustainable program, so that, companies don't have to deal with starts and stops and, kind of figure out keeping people on and off. And then, of course, the very people who, again, we're trying to help here don't lose trust in government and, think it's, why should I sign up for 2 months when it's just going to turn off again? So I think that's kind of where we are at this point. Unfortunately, it is unfortunate that we're at this point and we haven't found a way to pay for it and keep it going in the interim. But hopefully there's still a path forward.
This is odd for me to say, but I agree with a lot of what you just said. Not all of it, obviously. Our members are open to the discussion of restoring the program as part of a broader USF reform, Universal Service Fund reform effort. As long as the program is reformed to its right size, so it's targeted at the households who truly need a subsidy to afford broadband, as well as, like I said, a sustainable funding source, and that's why we think the USF reform is a good place for that once the program is right-sized. Because again, we can't rely on these short-term, one-year extensions where we're just going to have these constant cliffs of people. And consumers are then left wondering, is this program going to continue? Am I going to lose it again at the end of the year? Or do you have to rely on Congress and that, great budget process that we have that's definitely reliable? And so that's a concern that it's not fair to consumers to keep to rely on that. So again, as long as if we can find a way to agree on important reforms and find that long-term sustainable funding solution, I think we would be open to that discussion.
Ranking Member Cruz has been open to finding a solution here as well. I think, we agree it can't just simply involve injecting new billions to restart the program without addressing the program's underlying flaws, which aren't just limited to waste, fraud, and abuse, but also having an inflationary effect on broadband prices. And so, And also just, we need to address the oversubscription of the program, but as John said, to ensure that the subsidy is limited to households that and families that truly need it to get online. Ranking Member Cruz actually laid out a blueprint for addressing ACP's flaws in his Easy Connect Act, and that involves addressing the inflationary effect ACP's had on broadband prices, narrowing eligibility, eliminating program duplication so we don't have multiple low-income broadband programs floating throughout the government, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, and also repealing harmful Biden administration programs, Biden-Harris policies like Title II and disparate impact digital discrimination liability that have had a harmful effect on broadband investment and affordability. And we agree with Jennifer that ACP shouldn't be resurrected without a clear plan to fund it. Americans want stability, and starting it up only to have it lapse again isn't really fair to low-income families.
Senator Cantwell definitely thinks that ACP should be resurrected, and she's going to fully fund the program through her Spectrum and National Security Act. She keeps asking us about what's happening now. It's the beginning of the school year. Families, it's the beginning of the school year. Families are needing having multiple bills. families need to be able to provide internet at home so their kids can do their schoolwork. She keeps asking us about that. 23 million people participated in ACP. I think FCC data indicated that up to 23 or 24% of those participants did not have broadband before, and larger numbers had inconsistent broadband, or broadband whenever they had the money to provide it. It's the school year. People need to telework, or people need to do remote learning. People might be going back to school. We need to have ACP up and running again. She talked about how when she went back to Washington State, she got a call from one of the Washington school districts, and was really touched when she heard about a student who hadn't been doing her homework for weeks on end. And the reason was the teacher called the parent and was like, "Why is your daughter not doing any of the work?" And it was because the family couldn't afford a high quality broadband for her to do her remote work from home. It's heartbreaking to see folks who don't have ACP and families who are struggling to pay for all their bills, and now ACP isn't there. So she absolutely supports ACP, and everyone here also knows the importance of ACP also to certain providers when they're submitting their BEAD application. So she 100% supports that.
Well, thank you. And we've got about 3 minutes left, and you just teed up BEAD very nicely for me. So we're going to conclude with the BEAD question, if we may. The BEAD program is another one that was created with the goal of connecting all Americans, regardless of how difficult they are to serve. And the House Energy and Commerce Committee recently held a hearing to discuss the BEAD deployments. So John and Jennifer, do you believe that tech neutrality is important to the BEAD program? And if so, do you think there's more to do to ensure that neutrality exists?
Absolutely. That's been one of our members' main beefs with the BEAD program, is that the initial NOFA that came out was not clearly technology neutral. It looked like the administration was putting a heavy hand on on one technology, which is a good technology and it's important to give to people, but is not the sole answer here to connecting every American. With fiber, the concern is if you try to build it out to everyone, $42 billion is going to go very quickly, and then you are going to miss the goal of serving every American. So that's something we've pushed the administration on since the very beginning of this program. We're pleased that they finally got the message and recently requested comment on their guidance on alternative technologies. We fully believe that fixed wireless, LEO, need to be a part of the solution to serving all Americans. That is how you get every American access to broadband and achieve the goal of using the goal of the $42 billion that Congress provided.
Thank you for that. And Jennifer?
Yeah, I would just say the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the BEAD program provisions, was tech neutral, but it had a priority for fiber. I think that was reflected in the NOFO. I think NTIA from the start has said we're going to review everything and we're going to take a look. But I think, when you're using government, dollars spending and you're investing in this once in a generation, for sure, kind of infrastructure investment, I think we also have to be mindful of ensuring that we're getting the most out of that money, and that requires us to look longer term. I think you heard the Assistant Secretary earlier talk a little bit about RDOF and kind of the aftermath of that. And I think what you see reflected is a I think Congress wants to see, our members certainly want to see that this money is used in the most efficient way possible, and that is a long-term sometimes analysis of it, and of what the investment is going to be used for. So, I think certainly there are places in the country where all kinds of technology will be approved, will be used. I think that's reflected in the state plans. But again, I think using the funding in the most efficient way possible is important here, and that is sometimes a bigger analysis than looking at like in the moment how much something costs, and making sure that as many communities are connected with the best technology, the longest term technology that is going to be helpful.
Thank you for those comments. Arielle, Betsy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I would just say technology neutrality has been a guiding principle of American broadband policy over the last decade. That's because allowing different technologies to compete fosters innovation and it brings down prices. And that's why in the infrastructure law, Congress enshrined the principle of technology neutrality in the BEAD program. Any provider, regardless of technology, could compete for subsidies as long as they met baseline performance requirements. But instead of respecting the will of Congress, the NTIA under VP Harris's leadership as broadband czar pursued extreme technology bias through the BEAD program. And Ranking Member Cruz actually put out a report called the Red Light Report, where it showed that this would raise costs for taxpayers and likely result in many areas left behind. It also comes at a steep cost of public safety, as the recent hurricane has shown. Services like Starlink have proved to be, have proven life-saving connectivity in times of emergency. Assistant Secretary Davidson referenced the $3 billion that was not awarded through the RDOF. Well, $1 billion of that was the Starlink award. And so in retrospect, it kind of seems downright scandalous that was revoked when we've seen the kinds of benefits that Starlink had that low Earth orbit satellite service has been able to provide during these difficult times. And we also, fixed wireless similarly has proven to be an incredibly popular technology for consumers. So it doesn't really make sense to discriminate against that technology either. It seems like finally, after years, NTIA is starting to recognize that that this extreme technology bias wasn't the right approach, and so they're putting out new guidance. And I guess I'm just concerned that this might be a little, this is a little too late.
Absolutely.
Fiber is the gold standard, and NTIA has been, has conceded as much. That was the instruction in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but there are times when that just isn't possible to deploy fiber. And NTIA is doing the work through its NOFOs to look at situations, parts of the country, circumstances where that they need to look at other options. And through that, they are going to put together the plans to come up with the way to get the best broadband to the most locations possible. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, huge influx of money for critical infrastructure of broadband.
Thank you for that. We've gone over, but I haven't gotten the sign like they're going to cut the mics yet. Can I just do one last question? And it'll be like a speed date. And this is kind of a fun one to wrap it up, if I may. And I love this because I get to show get a little insight into y'all and your personalities. We're all here discussing wireless, and we have multiple devices, and we all live on our phones. So name your favorite app and why it's your favorite. Betsy.
So my real job is being a chauffeur to my 2 children. So my app is Waze, but it was set on boy band, but it's currently set for 80s aerobics instructor, and my kids don't get any of the jokes, but it's very funny.
Oh, I have to change that.
Most of you don't get it either, I'm sure, but it's very funny.
That's awesome.
Especially when you're speeding.
Oh, funny. Arielle?
Okay, so right now, it's a very holy time for Jews. We're in the period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I've actually been deleting some apps that maybe aren't the most, soul cultivating or spiritually elevating. But one app that I'm always going to keep on my phone that I'm really grateful for is an app that contains the entire Jewish prayer liturgy. And so it's called the Art Scroll app, and it makes it easier for me to pray and cultivate my soul, and it's just amazing that in this day and age that my smartphone would enable that.
That's cool. That's pretty cool. So I don't have this app on my phone anymore, but I met my wife on Hinge 4 years ago. So gotta say that's my favorite app. Just want to make sure it's clear that I don't have the app on my phone anymore. It is the app that's meant to be deleted, as they say. So that's my favorite.
Jennifer.
All right, that's hard to follow up. This feels a little bit like a cheat, but I was really debating this one. I think probably my podcast app, because that's, I moved to the burbs during COVID, and so I spent a lot of time behind the wheel, and that's how I get through, whether I'm listening to policy tech discussions or laughing on some comedy show. That's probably the one I use the most, and putting kids to sleep at night, so.
I love it. Well, y'all, thank you so very much for joining us today. And thank the audience. Thanks, y'all.